Most gardeners think the problem starts when a weed shows up. In a lot of backyards, the real problem starts when every volunteer plant gets treated like a threat before anyone asks what it is. That is how people end up working hard to protect a few tender crops while pulling out food that was already growing for free. I see this all the time. The raised beds get compost, water, and attention. The rough edges get sprayed, chopped, or covered over. The cracks by the drive, the strip along the fence, the patch behind the shed, the places that actually tell you what wants to grow there, those get ignored. And some of the most useful edible plants on a property tend to show up in exactly those spots. Now, I need to say one thing before we go further. Do not eat any wild or volunteer plant unless you can identify it properly. And do not harvest from places that have been treated with herbicides, weed and feed, roadside spray, or anything else you would not want in your kitchen. Good judgment comes first. But once you know what you are looking at, a lot of what people call weeds stop looking useless very quickly. The first lesson here is simple. A plant is not worthless just because you did not plant it. In fact, some of the toughest, most useful greens in a yard are the ones that arrive on their own. They do not need pampered soil. They do not need a perfect watering schedule. They do not collapse the minute the weather turns against them. That matters more than people admit, especially in a season with late frosts, a wet spring, a dry summer, or a week when life gets busy and the garden does not get handled exactly right. That is where dandelion deserves a second look. Most people know dandelion as the plant they keep trying to get out of the lawn. I know it as one of the earliest reliable greens of the year. When the garden is still only half awake, dandelion is often already up and usable. And nutritionally, it is not some desperate fallback food. USDA food data has long shown dandelion greens are especially rich in vitamin K, and they are strong in vitamin A precursors as well. That alone should make people stop treating it like a plant with no value. But the real advantage is not just what it contains. It is when it shows up, and how little it asks from you. Spinach sounds impressive on paper, and it can be excellent. But spinach wants decent timing, decent moisture, some protection from heat, and often a bit of luck if slugs or sudden warm weather get involved. Dandelion does not care about any of that nearly as much. It pushes through cold. It handles compacted ground better than most cultivated greens ever will. And it comes back from a root system built to survive. That is not just resilience. That is a food source with almost no maintenance cost. There is a mistake people make with dandelion, though, and it is the reason many decide they do not like it. They try it too late. Older leaves get more bitter, especially once the weather warms and the plant starts shifting its energy. The young spring growth is the part to pay attention to. That is when the leaves are at their best for eating. Harvest them early before they get coarse, and you are dealing with a completely different experience. That timing lesson matters far beyond dandelion. A lot of useful weeds are best when they are young, tender, and still in active growth. People wait until the plant looks large and obvious, then judge it at the worst possible stage. And that is where good food gets dismissed for the wrong reason. Dandelion is also a good reminder that useful plants do not have to fit the neat little categories sold in garden catalogs. The leaves are one thing. The flowers have kitchen uses too. The roots have a long history of use as well. I'm not saying it replaces your whole garden. It does not. But it fills a gap beautifully, especially in that stretch, when you want something fresh before the main harvests begin. And that is where many gardens are weaker than people realize. A lot of growers spend so much energy on peak summer abundance that they ignore the edges of the calendar. Early spring matters. The hungry gap matters. The weeks when not much else is ready matter. If a plant gives you dependable food in that window, it has earned more respect than a lot of gardeners give it. Then summer comes, and the whole question changes. Because once the heat arrives, a different kind of weed starts showing you what real toughness looks like. Purslane is one of the best examples. Most people spot it sprawling low through bare soil and think it is just a sign they are falling behind. Sometimes it is actually showing you which plant in the bed understands summer better than the crop you are trying to save. While lettuce turns bitter and bolts, while shallow-rooted greens start struggling. While the top inch of exposed soil dries hard in the sun, purslane keeps growing. It likes warmth. It handles drought far better than most leafy crops. And if you garden anywhere with hot spells, dry beds, or erratic watering, that should get your attention fast. This is also where the usual weed logic starts to fail. People often assume that if a plant thrives under stress, it must be low quality. But purslane is a good example of the opposite. It is well known for containing alpha-linolenic acid, one of the omega-3 fats that people rarely expect to get from a leafy plant at all. That is one reason it has been appreciated for generations in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cooking. Not because it was trendy, because it was useful, and it is useful in a very practical way. It helps fill a gap that many backyard gardens leave open. Potatoes give bulk, beans give substance, squash gives volume. But a productive garden also needs plants that bring freshness, minerals, and diversity in the middle of hard summer, when some of the nicest spring greens are already finished. Purslane steps into that slot without asking you to baby it. There is another detail here that matters. Purslane often shows up where the soil is open and exposed. That should tell you something. Bare soil is a signal. If that surface is heating up, drying out, and losing moisture, a plant like purslane can move in because the conditions suit it. So instead of just pulling it and moving on, a smart grower asks a better question. Why is this spot so open? Why is the soil uncovered? Why is the bed stressing out this early? That is one of the hidden values of edible weeds. Sometimes they are not only food, sometimes they are feedback. And that feedback can save you from making the wrong fix. A lot of people react to summer stress by watering more often, but more shallowly, which only makes weak-rooted crops even more dependent. Others leave the soil bare and wonder why every hot week feels worse than the last. Then they blame the season. But often, the problem started lower down, right at the surface, where the bed lost moisture, biology, and cover. Purslane does not solve that problem for you, but it does show you where the weakness is. And meanwhile, it is still edible. That is the part I want people to catch. Not every volunteer plant deserves to run wild. Good gardening still means deciding what stays, what goes, and what gets harvested before it takes over. But there is a huge difference between managing a living system and trying to sterilize it. One approach gives you more food, more resilience, and better observation. The other gives you cleaner lines and more work. And once you start seeing weeds that way, another plant begins to look very different too. One that plenty of gardeners have been yanking out for years while spending money to grow something weaker just a few feet away. Lamb's quarters is one of those plants. If you have ever had it come up near a bed edge, along a path, or in freshly disturbed soil, you already know how determined it is. Pale green leaves, a dusty look on the new growth, upright habit, fast development once the weather settles. A lot of gardeners pull it on sight because it looks like it does not belong. But this is where people confuse unfamiliar with useless. In real kitchen garden terms, lamb's quarters deserves far more respect than it gets. The young leaves cook down much like spinach. But in rougher conditions, it often holds itself together better than spinach ever will. That matters in ordinary backyards and allotments, where the garden is not some flawless test plot. You get slug pressure. You get a cold, wet spell that stalls one crop and kicks another into life. You get heat that arrives too early. You get a patch of soil by the compost heap that grows volunteers better than anything you sowed there on purpose. That is where lamb's quarters often proves what it is made of. Nutritionally, it compares very well with common leafy greens. It can bring useful amounts of minerals and a respectable amount of protein for a leaf crop. But even more important than the numbers is the habit of the plant. It grows where the soil has been disturbed, which usually means right where gardeners are already working, around bed margins, along the edge of new mulch, beside the places you dug, amended, watered, and walked past. In other words, it often places itself inside the system you already built. That should change the way you look at it. Not as an intruder, but as a volunteer that showed up because the conditions suited it. There is a practical correction here that most people never make. They spend all their energy forcing delicate greens to perform in every part of the garden, instead of noticing which useful plants are naturally suited to the weaker spots. That habit creates more work than it solves. A seasoned grower learns to separate the garden into classes of space. Prime space goes to the crops that truly need it. Edge space, rough space, awkward space, partial competition space, those are different. And sometimes the plants that thrive there are the ones that should earn a place in the harvest basket. Lamb's quarters also reminds you that not every productive plant has to be treated like a permanent resident. You do not have to let it seed through the entire plot and create a headache for next year. Harvest it young. Use it heavily where it appears in excess. Thin it where it crowds what you actually want to keep. That is the middle path productive gardeners understand, and tidy gardeners often miss. Useful does not mean uncontrolled. It means recognized and handled properly. And that same principle becomes even more important with smaller plants, because small plants are where people overlook value most easily. Wood sorrel is a good example. People mistake it for clover all the time, especially when they are moving quickly through the garden. But once you know the heart-shaped leaflets and that clean, sour bite, it becomes hard to ignore. It tends to show up in places many cultivated crops do not enjoy much at all. Light shade, damp edges, under shrubs, along the north side of a fence, at the foot of a raised bed, where the light is not quite strong enough to make the best use of the space. That makes it useful in a way that goes beyond taste. A lot of gardens have dead zones. Not dead because nothing grows there, but dead in the sense that the gardener gave up on them. Too shady for one crop, too awkward for another, too easy to ignore. Wood sorrel has a habit of making those places productive again, at least in a small but worthwhile way. Its flavor is the clue. That bright, tart note comes from oxalic acid, the same broad family of sharpness people recognize in rhubarb and sorrel, so this is not a bulk green. It is not something you treat like a pile of chard. It is a sharper plant, better used with purpose, in moderation, to brighten a salad or lift a bland bowl of greens. That is an important distinction, because one of the easiest ways to misuse edible weeds is to expect every one of them to do the same job. They do not. And once you stop asking them all to behave like lettuce, you start seeing what each one actually brings. Wood sorrel brings freshness at the edges. It makes use of awkward space. It gives you a bright flavor note, where most homegrowers are used to thinking only in terms of volume. And in practical gardening, variety like that matters more than it sounds. Not every useful plant earns its place by filling a basket. Some earn it by improving what is already on the plate. This is also where another myth needs correcting. People often think the only truly worthwhile plants are the ones that produce a lot of visible weight. But useful gardening is not only about bulk. It is also about timing, nutrient range, flavor, and how many different conditions on a property can be turned into something productive. A small patch of the right plant, growing where almost nothing else would, can be more valuable than a much larger patch of something you had to struggle to keep alive. And that brings us to clover, which may be one of the most underappreciated plants in an ordinary yard for a completely different reason. Most people think of clover as something between a lawn weed and an old-fashioned cover crop. What they miss is that it can be both useful ground cover and part of a productive garden system. White clover and red clover are legumes, and that matters because legumes work with bacteria that help fix nitrogen. Gardeners hear that phrase all the time, but many still do not connect it to what is happening right under their own feet. If you have clover growing in untreated ground, you are not just looking at something green. You are looking at a plant participating in soil improvement, slowly, quietly, without a bag of fertilizer, without a spreader, and without you having to remember a feeding schedule. That does not mean clover is a magic cure. Here is the fact that matters. Nitrogen fixation is not a fairy tale, but neither is it an instant fertilizer dump into the next plant over. That is where people get sloppy with the idea. Clover helps build and support the soil system over time. It protects the surface. It feeds pollinators when flowering. It contributes to the bigger rhythm of fertility and cover. In a garden that aims to be resilient rather than ornamental, that counts for a lot. And yes, clover has edible uses too. The young leaves can be used sparingly, and the flowers have a long history in teas and traditional herbal use. But to me, the bigger lesson with clover is not that it is a salad crop. It is that some weeds are valuable because they are doing a job your garden needs done, whether you noticed or not. That is a shift in thinking many gardeners never make. They divide plants into two groups, crops and weeds. But a more useful system is this: food plants, support plants, warning plants, and true troublemakers. Some plants feed you directly, some feed the soil, some tell you where the drainage is poor, where the soil is compacted, where the ground is bare, where fertility is patchy, where your management is weak. And then there are plants that genuinely do need controlling hard because they overwhelm the system. Good gardening is knowing the difference. Clover often sits in that support category, and once you see it that way, you stop mowing every patch of it, like it is doing harm by existing. In fact, one of the stranger habits of modern lawn culture is that people spend money removing a plant farmers once used on purpose to improve tired ground. That should tell you how disconnected appearance has become from function. There is a relieving truth in all this, and I think more gardeners need to hear it. You do not need to turn your whole yard into a wild patch. You do not need to stop growing your favorite vegetables. You do not need to romanticize every weed that appears. The goal is much simpler than that. Learn what is already helping you. Learn what is already feeding you. Learn what is filling seasonal or nutritional gaps. Then manage the space with a bit more intelligence and a bit less reflex. Because once you do that, one last plant starts to stand out for what it really is. Not just edible, not just resilient, but perfectly timed to solve one of the biggest weak points in almost every home food garden. That weak point is the gap before the main garden starts feeding you. A lot of people think about harvest in terms of summer abundance. Tomatoes piling up on the counter, beans coming fast, zucchini getting ahead of you, potatoes lifting well. But the harder stretch in a food garden is often earlier than that, right at the tail end of winter and the beginning of spring, when stored food feels old, the weather still turns cold, and the beds are not producing much yet. That is where chickweed becomes far more important than it looks. Chickweed is easy to miss if you are not paying attention. Low, soft, sprawling, tiny white flowers, tender green growth that forms mats when conditions suit it. In many temperate gardens, it starts moving before most people are really thinking about fresh harvests at all. And that timing is what gives it real value. It shows up before the garden gets generous. That matters more than people think. The most vulnerable part of a home growing system is not always mid-season when pests show up or drought hits. Sometimes it is that quiet stretch when not much is ready, your winter crops are fading, and the new season has not yet found its stride. If a plant reliably feeds you in that window, it is doing something most gardeners should respect. Chickweed does exactly that. The texture is one reason people who know it tend to keep coming back to it. It is tender, mild, and easy to use when young. Not a punishment green. Not one of those plants you force yourself to admire because it is useful. It is actually pleasant. That alone makes it valuable, because there is no point pretending a plant belongs in the kitchen if nobody wants to eat it twice. Chickweed usually passes that test. And it grows where home gardeners constantly overlook opportunity, along bed edges, around cold frames, near borders that warm slowly, in the half-settled spaces between what was there last season and what you mean to do next. It often uses the awkward calendar better than the gardener does. That is a lesson worth paying attention to. A productive garden is not only about what fills the peak months, it is about what closes the gaps. Chickweed helps close one of the biggest gaps of all. There is a practical correction here too. Many people clean beds too aggressively in late winter and early spring because they are eager to start fresh. They rake, scrape, hoe, and strip every surface before asking what is actually growing there. Sometimes that is necessary. Sometimes the space needs clearing for a crop that matters more. But sometimes they are removing the first fresh, edible growth they were going to get all year. That is the kind of mistake that only feels tidy until you realize what it cost you. And this is where the broader pattern becomes clear. Dandelion gives you one of the earliest dependable greens and asks almost nothing in return. Purslane holds on when heat and drought start knocking softer crops backward. Lamb's quarters turns rough, disturbed ground into useful leaf harvest. Wood sorrel makes awkward shaded corners more valuable and adds brightness where bulk greens fall flat. Clover feeds the system itself, improving ground and covering soil while people are busy trying to make everything look neat. Chickweed arrives before the main garden does and fills the hungry gap most growers forget to plan for. That is not a random collection of weeds. That is a working support system. Now here is the myth that needs to go. If you let any useful weed remain in the garden, you must be lazy, disorganized, or not serious about growing food. That is nonsense. Serious growers are not the ones who kill everything on reflex. Serious growers are the ones who know what each plant is doing, what each space can carry, and when a volunteer is more useful harvested than destroyed. That takes a steadier eye than people think. It is easy to make a garden look controlled. It is harder to make it genuinely productive. Those are not always the same thing. Some of the most decorative gardens are weak where it counts. They need constant buying, constant input, constant rescue. Then one weather swing, one missed week of watering, one slug-heavy spring, one hosepipe restriction, one stretch of hard heat, and the whole thing starts looking fragile. Meanwhile, the plants people called weeds are still there, still growing, still adapting, still finding a way through. That does not mean weeds replace the garden. And this is where balance matters. You still want your potatoes, your beans, your onions, your squash, your tomatoes, your proper storage crops. Wild and volunteer plants are not a complete answer. They are the layer most people ignore. They fill nutritional gaps, seasonal gaps, and system gaps. They give you food in rough corners, feedback about soil conditions, and a little insurance when the neat plan does not unfold exactly the way you hoped. That is their value. So the smarter question is not, should I stop pulling weeds altogether? The smarter question is, which of these plants are actually costing me more when I destroy them than when I learn to use them? That shift changes the whole feel of a garden. You stop seeing every rough patch as failure. You stop assuming productivity only counts when it is planted in rows. You start noticing that a healthy growing space is not always clean-edged and obedient. Sometimes it is messy in useful ways. Sometimes the land is offering you information before it offers you beauty. And if you are willing to read that information, you become a better grower. You also become a less wasteful one. Think about how much time and money goes into fighting what nature is already trying to establish in a yard. Lawn chemicals, weed fabric, extra mulch used badly, hours of pulling without a plan. And all the while, some of the plants being fought hardest are edible, nutrient-dense, seasonally useful, or beneficial to the soil. Once you see that clearly, it is hard to go back to blind cleanup. And here is the hopeful part. You do not need to rebuild your entire property to benefit from this. It is not too late if you have spent years pulling these plants. It is not too late if your garden has been all beds and no observation. Start small, learn a few plants well, watch where they appear, notice when they are tender, when they are useful, and when they cross the line into competition. That alone will change how productive your space becomes. Because the goal is not to surrender the garden to weeds. The goal is to stop wasting what is already working for you. If this gave you a new way to look at your yard, type "grow" in the comments and press like. I'd like to know which of these plants is already growing on your property, and whether you have been pulling food without even realizing it.